Hi, and mostly welcome to this lunch seminar and panel discussion on the topic of open and accessible data. And this is an event related to the Nobel Calling Stockholm Week. And we're going to discuss in the panel today if open and accessible data may be a recipe for research success. And, well, perhaps more Nobel Prizes, who knows? The topic is here, but we also have a panel with a lot of great people. So we're very happy to have you here today. Starting from this side, we have Sebastian Meyer, who is professor in healthcare logistics, but you're also vice dean of the CBH school here at KTH. Most welcome. And next to Sebastian, we have Jayant Ragatama. Sorry for pronunciation is bad. And you're also associate professor in healthcare logistics, but vice director of the digitalization platform at KTH. Then we have Will Usher, who is associate professor in integrated assessment for sustainable development and work at energy systems at KTH. Then we have Gustav Nilsson from Karolinska Institute, but you're also representing the Swedish National Data Service and coordinating the domain specialists there. And then last but not least, we have Sabine Höller, who is a professor at the Studies of Science and Technology and head of the Department of Philosophy and History here at KTH. So thanks a lot for joining us today. We are very happy that you want to discuss this with us. For the audience, if you're not familiar with the concept of open data and fair data, we're going to have a short introduction. Firstly, there's a lot of data in the world, and if data is used in research, collected or generated as a basis of scientific results, that is referred to as research data. And then some of it may be open data. That is data that you can openly download from the internet usually and use without restrictions. Then there's also the concept of fair data, which is described as a set of principles that make data findable and accessible. And accessible can be at different access levels. It may be open or it could be more restricted. But in a way, so it's interoperable. That is more technical, perhaps, so that the data can be used regardless of interpreted in the same way, regardless of what system you're using. And then the idea is that you do this work with describing the data so that it can be reused in society or for further research. So that was the introduction, and now we move on to the speakers. And the first question today is, do you see any major benefits with sharing data more openly in your research field? We can start with Sebastian.
Well, yes and no. And it might sound strange when sitting on a panel like this. Of course, opening up data really has its advantages because particularly when it comes to like more complex questions, you cannot do as an individual researcher all of the research in all of those pieces of the system yourself at once. So there it really helps to have open data. For instance, if you're a health researcher and you want to know something about environmental data, it would be nice to just get that in and explore some dimensions. There's also a drawback to it, and that is, do you still feel that you own your own data? When will you share it? In what way? So we really need to think about the governance of that to make sure that the incentives for actually collecting the right data are still there.
Adding on to that, there are of course obvious benefits, and I think something that is not very easily recognized is in how open data can make the academy more open, how it can make us more interdisciplinary. But then the obvious challenges are that we don't necessarily recognize the methods that come along with data from other domains, for instance. So yes, we can be more transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary in our work, but then we also need to recognize that, okay, there is some amounts of baggage or some amounts of knowledge or vocabulary that comes along with using data from other domains, for instance.
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think it's really important and very useful to have open data. In my field, so I work in energy and climate, and models are taking a bigger sort of role, I guess, in informing policy. Then transparency and openness becomes very important. So open data can really help make the policy decisions that are ultimately made more transparent. People can understand how those policy decisions were informed, and how the models and analysis that underpins those policy decisions were originally made. I think it's also important for efficiency. There's a lot of duplicate work that goes on with people taking the same data sets and manipulating them, processing them so that they can then use them. And if we just shared those data sets openly, then we can save a lot of effort and a lot of time and do more interesting research. And then I think it's really beneficial for researchers' careers, particularly young researchers. If you share data sets with your papers, it can be a really great way to promote your work. People might be interested in using your data in a way that you hadn't envisaged, and they'll cite your papers, they'll cite your data sets. So it's a really good way to sort of to kickstart your career in research.
Yeah, Gustav?
I'd like to answer this question from my own standpoint as a medical researcher. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out what is best for the patients, which diagnostic and therapeutic procedures actually work compared to others. And to do that, we really need to gather as much data as we can from all the studies that have been made and assess all of the data together. So I spent a lot of time digging through archives and looking in scientific journals to find results from old studies. A lot of the time, not all the results are published, not even as summary statistics in a paper. And of course, if individual participant data are available, then we can do much more. We can do more interesting modeling. But really, we need all the data in order to be able to tell which treatments are effective for our patients and to make science cumulative, as I think most of us think that it ideally should be.
Sabine, do you have something to add?
Yes, sure. And I would answer that question from my perspective as a historian of science and technology, also environmental history. And then the first observation would be that this question isn't really new, because science hasn't been a secluded enterprise. It was collaborative since, well, at least the modern era. And so my first observation would be that it was not only beneficial, but really vital to share data. And we can see that even already in the 19th century with large concerted efforts like the first international polar year, where basically many countries synchronized Earth observation efforts. So the field sciences were really relying on sharing and circulating data, also centralizing data. So what is perhaps new is really the data infrastructures that we work with today. We don't work any longer with with individual correspondence that a Royal Geographical Society would then collect. But we have other formats. We don't enroll lay people in the same way. Now we call it citizen science. So we do have large data projects in the earth sciences and in the field sciences. And that was happening at the same time as the nations were forming, even during the Cold War. So competition and collaboration was always going hand in hand, and that was also because the objects of study, be it atmospheres, be it the oceans, were too vast to be researched by one individual or one institution or even one nation. So these projects were national and always also institutional, highly symbolic, but they were also always collaborative. One example I would like to point to is NASA, right? NASA has this open data policy. They didn't have it from the start. It was, I think, introduced with the CSAT program, a satellite program on the seas, the oceanography project. And that was in the late 70s, so 20 years after NASA was founded. And perhaps the other benefit is really, as you also have mentioned, that it increases a research community, data sharing. It quickens publication. It does also help validate data in a broader sense. So you get intellectual exchange and also criticism. That was what NASA's thinking and reasoning here was. Thanks.
Oh, thanks. So then we move into the next question, which is the other side of it. Are there barriers or risks associated with sharing data in your field? What do you think, Sebastian?
There are, but the question is, does it outweigh the advantages? To connect to, for instance, like, where do you collect the data from? Somebody mentioned citizen science, which is the modern word for, indeed, getting data from non-scientists to a certain extent, but also the importance of the institutionalization of how do you collect this open data. What I observe is that there's this back and forth between I want to discover my thing versus these are the official platforms that we work on as scientists. Collecting data is expensive. It's very expensive compared to the analysis. So of course, when data is very expensive to collect, it should be made as open as possible, and that might be like inverting curves or have an inverse relation. At the same time, the knowledge about what that data is very difficult to transfer. How do I, actually as an exercise for this, I was looking back at my own files, SPSS files, of my own PhD, and thought like, can I still interpret what was decoded there? Well, that was a sobering experience.
What do you think was missing from that old data of your own?
The precise... I actually did annotate rather well what all the fields meant, but what was missing was the connection between the annotation of the field and the setup of the experiment. Because then, only then you know how that thing that I defined, that I observed, actually was connected to the way the data came in or how the experiment was set up. And that is it's easy when you have a large CERN infrastructure. But if you do social sciences research or, well, in health, of course, the medical data is rather well described. When it comes to patient-reported outcomes measures from SPAMs, far less. So there is this diversity in how well do I understand, how well do I know what I collect here. And there you cannot take the researcher entirely outside of the data.
So the data is connected to the method, which is connected to the results. So
and to the person doing it.
Yes,
Can you take the person out of
no.
of the description? Difficult.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes at least in a lot of labs and universities, open data is kind of presented as the end result of a long research project. And I believe that we need to a large extent, a cultural transition in how we actually manage that and govern that during the process of research. It's not the outcome, but it's actually a lot of intermediate steps, like Sebastian mentioned. Okay, we need to annotate it, we need to have metadata, we need to connect that metadata to other domains and so on. We need to harmonize those efforts and have this as a long process rather than the outcome of a research project. And yes, the publication is nice, like Will said, and it'll help careers, but if we actually want to reap the full benefits of open data, we need to make this transition from how we're working today with data to actually putting in place these institutional structures or cultural practices in labs and so on to actually make this viable long term.
Yeah, so I think there are a number of risks. I think they're often more perceived risks than actual risks. So one, for example, is the risk of being scooped. So I've released my open data set, or I've released my code, and someone else is going to publish a paper before my paper gets published. So in some fields, that's more of a concern than others, but in the field I work in, that's not really much of a concern. I think there are also then security and commercial risks that often come up, particularly when you're approaching or working with industrial partners or even governments, and you want to actually produce a study that's transparent and open, as I described earlier, and you want to try and then release all of the underlying assumptions that have gone into your analysis. Then often this idea of, this information is commercially sensitive, or I think there are security issues with knowing the location of our power stations or other aspects, despite the fact that often this information is anyway with a bit of work already publicly available. So I think there are risks, but as Sebastian said, I think the risk of not opening data, given we're really currently working in a world of closed science at the moment. That's sort of been the new normal. People are not really sharing their results. It's very difficult to verify and reproduce published work. And I think it basically means that we should really ask ourselves a question as scientists: are we doing science if no one can actually reproduce our results? They can't get the data to verify that what we've said is correct. I think there are risks, but they're manageable, and the risks of inaction outweigh the costs or the benefits of moving to a more open system.
I'd like to follow on there. We do have very large reproducibility problems in many quantitative disciplines. And I think one of the reasons for that is the emphasis on publishing papers as the main source of credit for scientists. When I apply for grant or when I apply for a new job, I'm asked to send in a publication list. And I expect that people will look at which journals I have published in, but that they will probably not go and look at the papers and see if the numbers add up in the results that I have described, and so on. The data are, in my opinion, where most of the value is, but we don't have a way yet to assign credit to researchers for sharing their data. This whole model of looking mainly at papers, in my opinion, is something that dates back to a much older view of a scientist as a kind of lone genius who is responsible for the entire work from beginning to end and whose professionalism guarantees that everything is correct. It's not well suited to what we have today with teamwork and opportunities to share research objects at intermediate steps online. In conclusion, abolish the journals and abolish the Nobel Prize.
So, do you agree with that conclusion? So, maybe a hard question.
Well, my point or position is, from a historical perspective, that science is a very collective enterprise. This is what I was also trying to say before. As a historian, I could say, well, our data are always open because it's the archives, right? And then the actual value is perhaps not in the data that everyone can access, but it's in the interpretation. But actually, my answer to the question of drawbacks or obstacles would be the quality of data, the metadata, the data infrastructures are an obstacle. We do have a lot of data, but sometimes, well, we don't have the tools to access them. So the data might be open, but not the tools. That is one obstacle, as I see it. There is also problems that have to do with what we now call data tsunami, right? There's a lot of data available, but it's not always useful. I mentioned the polar year in the 1880s. Well, that data was not processed properly. So actually it ended up in a veritable data graveyard because there were no techniques to actually compile and then publish everything. And these data can be brought back to life. There's historical data sets also that can be reused somehow, but that is not very trivial. That's not a trivial exercise. So one problem, as I see it, is of course data friction and the non-compatibility of data, because the naked data don't come with that qualifying information, so it's useless to another researcher, and you mentioned that already. Then we have data gaps. That's, of course, a problem of what is being researched, and it's not always distributed uniformly, so we have a lot of knowledge on one item or object and then hardly any on another. So that's a question of data justice, I would say. And then we have an action gap. So you could say, well, IPCC, we have data en masse, but there's also a question like how is it being used? And sometimes it's not being used really. So there's also a question of how are these data being translated into politics. So that is not really well researched currently. Then there is a risk that I see is data governance, and that has to do with increasingly private enterprises, corporations, large techno science corporations that tap into all kinds of available data and reformat in a way the accessibility or non-accessibility, like big Silicon Valley operations. And that is something to be careful about, I think, because it challenges us to think more about how private and public ownership of data is actually distributed, and who can tap into what we produce every way, like GPS data and so on.
So you've all been into the value of data and usefulness of data. What stakeholders in society do you think benefit most from open data versus fair data? Do you have an idea about that? Let's start again from Sebastian.
Could you start one now?
We can start from the other way around if you want to.
No, but who has use of our research anyway? I think the discussion should mostly be about how do we get the scientific apparatus as useful to the public outcomes that we try to achieve. And access to data is a fairly one of them. Access to data is a fairly diverse aspect. It's one of the things that we need to put in the motor to make the car go faster. Well, assuming you have a non-electric car. If you think of open versus fair, I believe in fair the position of the researcher is better represented to a certain extent. Not everything can be open, and open very quickly turns into very large-scale projects with those governance issues and reliability, believability issues. becomes fairly quickly fairly expensive. FAIR seems to be more tailored to what we do as individual scientists to a certain extent. And then to connect to the culture question, if we do that, then I believe all of the users or all of the beneficiaries of our research or research as a whole will actually benefit, rather than picking out individual stakeholders.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a two-way street, right? I mean, us opening up our academic research and our data will potentially have benefits, but there is also this aspect of participation and openness in society, and do we necessarily have the infrastructure or the methods to get back insight from citizens or from citizen science? Open data is a necessary but not sufficient condition to realize the value of research, and we need to critically think about whether we are opening it up in the right ways and whether we have the mechanisms to actually realize the value of opening our world up more than we have.
I think that the main sort of stakeholder, the main audience for scientific output is ultimately the public. We are publicly funded, and therefore it behoves us to make our findings, our data, and all of the other scientific outputs available to anyone in the public realm who wants to find them. There are a huge number of benefits for making, or potential benefits for making this information open. There are benefits for innovation. So someone might want to found a company and they need some open, a particular data set which a scientist may well have released. We can't know all of the benefits or the costs of releasing data, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't release it anyway, unless it has an obvious sort of security or privacy issue. In terms of open versus fair data, then, I mean, it's clear that it's not just good enough just to make data downloadable on the internet. That's not very helpful. Data needs a license. You need to understand the exact parameters over and permissions that you have in order to use that data. If data isn't described correctly, then there's a risk that you could misuse it. And that's, for a scientist, that's probably the worst thing that could happen if someone was to take a data set that you had produced and then, come up with results that completely oppose the ones that you had come up with. So there are a number of risks with just dumping data and releasing it in an uncontrolled manner, which should be avoided. And the FAIR principles give us some, these guidelines to try and avoid those worst situations.
So I'd like to answer this question again, starting from what I alluded to already with evidence-based practice in medicine. We have plenty of people in society who are trying to practice their profession in a science-based way, but who are not necessarily within academia. This can be doctors in hospitals and care centers anywhere, but it can also be many other professions, social services, teaching, education, and many others. And in order for them to do that, they of course need access to our results. More broadly, we also need better data for decision-making in society, and I think we still haven't learned all the lessons from the last pandemic yet about how to best provide high-quality data fast when it's needed, and maybe also how to design our societal decision-making such that it generates data and we can evaluate what's going on.
I am working mostly on environmental data and here I would identify stakeholders that work on the intersection between climate science and policy making. And those are stakeholders that often work on a public request or a governmental request, but are perhaps NGOs, non-governmental institutions. Also sometimes it can be governmental institutions and organizations that actually produce but also consume data and are really relying on quality data from, for instance, meteorological organizations or climate scientists that then can feed into visualization of trends and so on, and then feeding into policy making attempts. So those, I would say, are perhaps the ones that most urgently need scientific data that are open and accessible.
Thanks a lot. Now we've been talking about the public as a stakeholder. Do we have any questions from the public or the audience in this room to the panel? Can you just raise your hand? So, anyone in the live room? Yes, we have a question. I have to.
Thank you. Alexei Pasechny, researcher at SEED, the Sustainable Development Department. I wonder, could you reflect on how the academy should be changed to actually be fit for working from the open data and fair data paradigm? Because, like, I should confess, like for me, it's always a challenge. Okay, should I write more on a paper, or should I work on basically publishing it properly on GitHub and other things? And I don't see really that it's very common for many disciplines to incentivize this. It's just Journal of Computer Software. I mean, several disciplines that have this tradition of publishing data and recognize it as publication. Otherwise, it's just, okay, you can be scooped, but not much other than that. Thank you.
So, who would like to start with the answer to that question or discussion?
I could start. So yeah, it's a big question, right? How do we transform our universities and other institutions towards this? I mean, I can say a little bit about what KTH is doing. So I'm part of a working group on open science, and by the end of March next year, we'll have some recommendations on how to better adopt and align KTH's strategic work with with the current landscape, this push towards open science. Personally, then I think from an individual researcher's perspective, then I think we should do as much as we can. It is down to us as individuals, as individual researchers. It's us that own those data sets or that are responsible for collecting them. And it's us that writes the code that transforms those data sets into other data sets and visualizes the results. So I think as individuals, then we can do a lot actually to push forward. And obviously the system change needs to happen as well, but that will happen at a slower rate. But we can learn about those practices and maybe make small incremental steps. We publish our data sets. We spend a bit of time writing some really good metadata for our data sets, research about open licenses, educate ourselves about the difference between open access publications, open data, and open source. So I think by taking individual responsibility, we can sort of grab a hold of this issue and affect change as well within our departments and sort of change things from the grassroots up, as well as the longer term system change. It's also worth saying that there are many funding organizations really pushing this as well. For example, the European Commission does expect models to be open sourced, data sets to be released under open licenses. So that's another way that change will be affected.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, like I said earlier, I mean, we shouldn't view this as the outcome of a research project, but a daily practice. And I know Rosa and the library have been working on infrastructures to make this easier. There are data management plans which you can put in place. I know the SNDS has guidelines to make this all easier and to provide templates for just naming conventions and vocabularies and so on. And just instituting this from the beginning of a research project is probably easier than at the end. So it's, yeah. Just make it part of our daily work, and a lot of things will become easier and more streamlined as we go along. It's a cultural transition. The system change will happen slower, but yeah.
Yes, the tension is real, I do believe, but things are happening. And how can we make a change? Well, I think that we need to work both from the top down, and there are things going on. There's a European initiative for reforming research assessment, and there's a working group of the Swedish Association of Higher Education Institutions. Of course, that's going to take a long time. At the same time, I believe we need to work from the bottom with a kind of a pluralistic experimentation on how to develop new principles and processes and methods for assessment to accurately find and assign value to different research products that a researcher has put out there. And we don't really know how to yet, but I think we're in the process of finding out in the next few years, and things are going to happen.
You feel like you want to add something, or should we take another question from the audience? We have a question here from...
So this is a question from the Q&A in the webinar. Andrea Janung, he asks, many types of research data can't be published with open access, restricted data, but may still be published as open as possible. For example, with rich/fair metadata, open documentation, access requirements, etc. In your opinion, what information is important to provide when publishing restricted data? For example, when it comes to discoverability, usefulness for automation or AI, classification, granularity, and so on.
Seems to be a question from someone who's into the fair data. Do you have any comments on that?
If I could start without being a specialist on any domain. Of course, there are things like identifiable data that we cannot share. Very clearly, if there are personal details, then basically you need to have ethical approval to be able to access that data. Therefore, it is almost impossible to make that open unless very specific circumstances. If you think about data that is highly sensitive for security, locations of stuff, you were in Earth observation, well, might be everybody knows where our nuclear reactors are, but there might be other things in Sweden that may be not so smart to really put out in the open. What we know, for instance, from the health domain, and looking at Gustav as well, is very often you can de-identify data. You can still do a lot, but it's important to think fairly creatively about what is actually identifiable and what is not. And there I observe a shift from, no, you can't access this, to, oh, we just take out this, we put in an anonymization identifier or so. And for instance, the Socialstyrelsen has a very good service if you want to couple these data sets and have ethical approval to do that. So there is the open part of the data, and there's the same data, but with those parts that you cannot access, for which we have official infrastructures where you can request. Now, of course, there are waiting times and not everything is perfect, but that might be a way of thinking about it, like having a private part and having a public part next to each other. Because if you can do something with the public part, that could shape the research question, which could shape what you actually want to ask for in a request to the more secluded data that has to go through all the applications.
And maybe I can. I share that view because I was thinking from a historical perspective, or from my perspective as a historian, the data that are not open are oral history data, often. If they're not digitized and also published, but there's interviews. Social sciences work with interviews that are usually also classified in a sense because they contain personal data, personal information. So those we do not share. We only share the published part. And that is very much, as Sebastian just said, a bit of a divide between what is only accessible to the actual researcher and then what becomes public in whatever publication we create from it. I don't really have a good solution on how to treat this kind of information that is often qualitative information also, that you need to really be very careful about how you make it public, and it always needs the informed consent of those that we retrieve this information from. That's quite a challenge, actually.
I'd like to first say that if you're a researcher and wondering, how do I make my data fair? And Andrea, who asked this question, mentioned a number of things. My main message to a researcher would be, use a good repository that will take care of these things for you, such as the Swedish National Data Service.
So you end with a commercial there for your organization?
No, because I'd like not to end, if I may, and say something briefly also about other things we can do with sensitive data, which of course we have a lot of in medical research. And I'd like to make the point that, of course, we have the obligation to our participants to protect their privacy, naturally. But we also have an obligation to try to make the most of their contribution and make the value in the data available as far as we can. And there are many things that we still can do, such as anonymizing the data, and sometimes that means taking out a lot of the data, but we can still publish the data that remains. Even if it's just one single column of outcomes that are not linked to anything, that still proves that the data, or at least provides a strong indication that the data exists, and let someone else count up how many outcomes are in each category and so on. We can share other things like, for example, recently I was involved in a study where we successfully reconstructed a data set by simulating it from a correlation matrix that had been published in a scientific article. And that's another example of data that you can share even when the individual observations are sensitive.
Another question from the online audience, I think.
Yes, we have a question from Vinota Megal-Renat, and this is also the question that was on my mind. He's asking about how you could encourage institutions to incentivize not just papers, but also the publications of the data. And some of you talked a bit about, the risk of being scooped, and the data cannot just be published as is, but it needs good descriptions and metadata, and you need to know how it really fitted into the experiment, as Sebastian was talking about. So, how do we, make researchers want to actually publish their data?
So that was a question about the incentives, I guess. Who wants to start?
I feel the pressure. It's interesting here because to a certain extent it is individual incentives, to a certain extent it is also a culture. What are the expectations? I mean, all of us working in science are expected to work in a traceable, reproducible way. I hope that we, with time, also will get to a culture where it's normal to work in an open way, where we can publish as much as possible. Because if you want to use some data, you need to also contribute some data. In the shorter term, of course, academic career tracks, but also the Swedish IP system do not really help, because all of us working here, all of us have the right to our own inventions, which we could commercialize. I mean, KTH Innovation is really big and really good at that. Absolutely fantastic. But it also, to a certain extent, hampers the individual incentives to actually contribute. So a good discussion about when do we incentivize people to commercialize their own research versus how much do you do in the open? And it's a difficult discussion, because every field looks different, every type of invention looks different. Not everything can be made into an app. But still, we need to have that one.
So I think we have 30 seconds left, so it will be the final word.
Okay, so I mean, the current model for incentivizing people is to turn everything into publications. So you can currently write a wrapper paper around your software repository, and you can write a short paper describing a data set. And that's a bit of a hack. It's not really a sufficient, it doesn't sufficiently meet the sort of challenge that was placed here by Gustav, that we need to understand what the real value of each of these types of outputs are. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we could go on for hours, but now our time is up. So I would like to really thank you a lot for participating, and thanks to the audience for listening. I had a nice time, so I hope you had as well. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.